15 years of marriage, 2 kids aged 12 and 14, and a life that felt like it was drowning in an endless cycle of sacrifice, exhaustion, and financial strain. Our once vibrant love had been smothered under the weight of responsibility for our children's futures, for keeping a roof over their heads, and for scraping together enough to give them the best possible life. But at what cost? We were trapped in a suffocating dance of survival, where every decision revolved around school fees, extracurricular activities, and making ends meet. The early years of our marriage, when we were young and hopeful, now seemed like a cruel joke. Poverty clawed at us from every corner. There were nights I went to bed hungry so my wife could eat, mornings she skipped breakfast so the kids wouldn't have to. Every dollar stretched thinner than the last, leaving no room for anything resembling personal joy or fulfillment. The dreams we once shared, the vacations we'd take, the hobbies we'd explore, the quiet moments we'd savor, were buried beneath mountains of unpaid bills and sleepless nights. It wasn't just about money, though. The emotional toll was even heavier. My wife and I became strangers sharing a home, our connection fading with each passing year. She poured all her energy into being the perfect mother, while I worked myself to the bone trying to keep us afloat. Neither of us had time, or energy, to think about ourselves as individuals anymore. And yet, despite all this sacrifice, resentment began to creep in, unspoken but undeniable. It was as if the harder we tried, the more the universe demanded from us, until we were left hollow shells of who we used to be. As the years dragged on, I found myself sinking deeper into a suffocating abyss of loneliness and despair. The realization that my wife no longer saw me as her partner in love but merely as a roommate, a co-parenting companion, crushed me to my core. It wasn't just the lack of intimacy or physical connection, it was the profound emptiness of being invisible to the one person who once made me feel alive. Every glance she gave me felt transactional, every word exchanged carried the weight of obligation rather than affection. I became nothing more than a financial provider and a secondary parent, existing solely to fulfill duties. Her indifference pierced through me like shards of glass, leaving behind wounds that refused to heal. The darkest moments came when I caught myself questioning whether I even mattered anymore. Was I simply a paycheck, a name on the lease, or an extra set of hands for the kids? The thought gnawed at me relentlessly, dragging me into a pit of depression so deep that I barely recognized the man staring back at me in the mirror. Nights were the hardest. Lying next to her in bed, I felt miles away, as though an impenetrable wall had been erected between us. My mind raced with questions. What did I do wrong? Why doesn't she want me anymore? But there were no answers, only silence, cold, unyielding silence. I tried everything to bridge the gap, late-night conversations, heartfelt gestures, even therapy sessions where I bared my soul, hoping for some flicker of reciprocation. Yet, all I received was polite detachment. She didn't hate me, but she didn't desire me either. That apathy cut deeper than any anger ever could. It felt like I was trapped in a life sentence without parole, condemned to live out my days as a ghost in my own marriage. The worst part? Knowing that she viewed our relationship as enough while I was drowning in this emotional wasteland. In a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of our crumbling marriage, we made a decision that felt both radical and hopeful at the time. We experimented with the swinging lifestyle. It wasn't something either of us had ever imagined doing when we first exchanged vows, but after years of emotional disconnection and a sexless existence, it seemed like a last-ditch effort to reignite the spark between us. At first, it appeared promising. There were moments of excitement, fleeting bursts of passion, and even laughter as we explored this new dynamic together. For a brief period, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the solution to our problems. But reality soon shattered those fragile hopes. What started as an exploration quickly devolved into something far more unsettling. My wife, who had initially seemed curious and willing to try, revealed a truth that left me reeling. She didn't feel any desire, not for me, not for anyone else, not even within the context of swinging. The realization hit me like a freight train. Here we were, exposing ourselves to experiences meant to bring us closer, yet all it did was highlight the cavernous void in our relationship. Her lack of interest wasn't limited to me anymore, it extended universally, as if her ability to connect on any physical or intimate level had been extinguished entirely. The aftermath of this experiment only deepened the chasm between us. Instead of bridging the gap, it amplified every insecurity I harbored. Was I so unappealing that even the prospect of shared intimacy with others couldn't stir her? Or was there something fundamentally broken within her, something she refused to confront? Every unanswered question gnawed at me, leaving behind scars I couldn't heal. Our conversations grew colder, more mechanical, as though we were negotiating business deals rather than navigating the wreckage of our once passionate love. Ironically, the swinging experience, which was supposed to save us, became another nail in the coffin of our marriage. It stripped away whatever illusions I still clung to about fixing things through external means. Now, faced with her adamant declaration that she simply didn't want intimacy with anyone, I realized how powerless I truly was. No amount of effort, compromise, or experimentation could force someone to feel something they no longer did. And so, we returned to our lives as co-parenting roommates, carrying the weight of yet another failure, a failure that felt less like a mutual loss and more like a silent rejection of everything I thought we stood for. As we sat in that therapy session, the air thick with unspoken tension, my wife finally began to peel back layers of emotions she had buried for years. She admitted, her voice trembling, that she felt an overwhelming sense of regret, a deep ache for everything she believed she had lost in her personal life, friendships, joy, freedom. "I miss who I used to be," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't have friends anymore. I haven't laughed like I used to. Everything feels so heavy." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, but beneath her sorrow lay something far more unsettling, an invisible resentment directed at me. Though she couldn't articulate it clearly, I could feel it lurking in every pause, every hesitant glance. She blamed no one explicitly, yet the weight of her unspoken accusations crushed me. How could I, the man who vowed to love and protect her, become the silent antagonist in her story? Her admission left me grappling with my own inner turmoil. Was I responsible for stealing her happiness? Had I unknowingly chained her to this life of monotony and sacrifice? The questions gnawed at me, each one sharper than the last. But what hurt most was the realization that I couldn't fix this, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't understand why she felt this way. It was as if she stood on the other side of an impenetrable glass wall, screaming frustrations I couldn't decipher. My attempts to bridge the gap only seemed to widen it. Every suggestion I made, rekindling old hobbies, reconnecting with friends, was met with resistance or indifference. Her coldness wasn't just rejection, it was a suffocating reminder of my helplessness. For the first time in our marriage, I felt truly powerless, caught in a storm of emotions I neither caused nor controlled. The moment I implemented the 180 method, our fragile marriage detonated like a time bomb. My wife, who had grown accustomed to my constant emotional availability and financial support, was blindsided by my sudden transformation. Gone was the man who bent over backward to meet her every need. In his place stood someone cold, distant, and unyielding, a stranger she barely recognized. The shift wasn't subtle. I stopped offering help with personal tasks, declined requests that weren't essential, and maintained an icy demeanor whenever possible. Her initial reaction was visceral. Confusion morphed into anger, then despair. She accused me of being petty, even childish, but beneath her words lay something far more raw: fear. Fear that the foundation of our relationship, as one-sided as it had become, was crumbling beneath her feet. The tension reached its peak when I proposed splitting household expenses 50-50, a suggestion she perceived as not just practical but deeply symbolic. To her, this felt like a betrayal of everything we'd built together, a final severance of the invisible threads that still tethered us. "This is out of left field," she snapped, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're acting like we're strangers now?" In truth, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd asked for, a purely transactional co-parenting dynamic, but I hadn't anticipated how profoundly it would wound her. She saw it as a loss of control, a dismantling of the security she'd taken for granted. For years, she'd relied on my unwavering commitment, only to find herself suddenly untethered, forced to confront the reality of her choices. It was brutal, yes, but necessary, for both of us. As we sat in that coffee shop, the air heavy with emotion, I made a decision that felt both liberating and terrifying. If by Memorial Day 2025 our marriage hadn't improved, we would part ways for good. It was a line drawn in the sand, a final ultimatum that hung between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. The weight of it pressed down on both of us, but I knew it had to be said. We couldn't keep limping along in this purgatory of co-parenting indifference any longer. My wife's eyes filled with tears as I explained my reasoning, calmly, firmly, but not without pain. "I love you," I told her, "but love alone isn't enough. If we can't fix this, then we owe it to ourselves, and especially to our kids, to let each other go." The thought of losing her forever sent a chill through me. After 15 years together, how could I imagine life without the woman who had been my partner through every high and low? And yet, the alternative, a hollow existence where she saw me as nothing more than a roommate, felt equally unbearable. For her, the stakes were just as high. She too faced the possibility of losing someone she once cherished deeply, even if she couldn't muster the same feelings now. But beyond our personal heartbreak, what haunted us most was the impact on our children. How could we explain to them that their parents, who they adored and trusted, might no longer be together? Would they blame themselves? Would they grow up thinking this fractured dynamic was normal? Setting this deadline felt like playing Russian roulette with our future. Every day leading up to Memorial Day 2025 would be a test of courage, patience, and resilience. One misstep, one unresolved argument, and everything could crumble. Yet, there was also hope, a fragile flicker of light at the end of a very dark tunnel. After weeks of suffocating tension, something inside her began to shift. As I pulled back from my usual role as the ever-present support system, declining to help with personal tasks and focusing solely on myself, she started to see me differently. For so long, I had been a constant in her life, an unshakable pillar she took for granted. But now, with distance growing between us, cracks began to form in her carefully constructed walls. She noticed the little things, how I used to carry groceries without complaint, how I stayed up late helping the kids while she rested, how I quietly handled bills and chores without being asked. Now that those efforts were gone, replaced by cold transactional exchanges, panic set in. Her voice trembled one evening when she said, "You're not the same anymore." And for the first time, it felt like she meant it, not as an accusation, but as a confession. The turning point came during a coffee shop conversation on Memorial Day weekend. It was surreal. We hadn't sat down like this in years, just the two of us, away from the noise of our children and the weight of unresolved grievances. Tears streamed down both our faces as we finally spoke truths we'd buried deep within. She admitted feeling lost, afraid of losing not just a husband but someone who had always anchored her world. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of vulnerability. In return, I confessed the depth of my pain, the loneliness, the rejection, the fear that I'd never be enough for her again. That day, amidst tearful embraces and raw honesty, we made a pact. We agreed to fight, for ourselves, for each other, and for the family we cherished. The air buzzed with cautious hope, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in years, it felt like we weren't just co-parenting roommates or strangers sharing a home, we were partners again, battered but determined to rebuild. Despite the glimmers of progress, an unsettling undercurrent still lingered beneath the surface of our fragile reconciliation. My wife had begun therapy and was taking steps to address her depression, yet I could see the shadows of her struggles haunting her every move. Her emotional disconnection hadn't fully lifted, it ebbed and flowed like a relentless tide, pulling her back into moments of despair when I least expected it. She often spoke about feeling stuck, as though she were trapped in a fog that no amount of effort could clear. Meanwhile, my own fears gnawed at me relentlessly. What if this wasn't enough? What if one day she met someone who made her feel alive again, someone who could ignite a spark within her that I seemingly couldn't? The thought tormented me, planting seeds of insecurity that grew with each passing day. The looming deadline of Memorial Day 2025 hung over us like a ticking time bomb, its presence both motivating and suffocating. Every small argument or moment of silence felt heavier now, charged with the unspoken question, are we doing enough? We tried to focus on rebuilding trust, exploring intimacy, and nurturing ourselves individually, but the uncertainty weighed down every interaction. Was this just temporary relief, a fleeting calm before another storm? I feared that without addressing the root cause of her resentment and detachment, history might repeat itself. Even worse, I worried that her newfound independence, something I initially encouraged, could become a double-edged sword. As she rediscovered parts of herself outside our marriage, what guarantee did I have that she wouldn't decide she didn't need me anymore? Each time she went out alone or spent hours engrossed in self-care, I wondered if she was preparing for life beyond us. And so, we lived in a state of perpetual tension, caught between hope and dread, clinging to the fragile threads of our relationship while bracing for the possibility of its unraveling. The story ends not with a resolution, but with an ominous question mark hanging over their fragile future. Will they salvage the marriage that once burned so brightly, or will they part ways, two strangers who shared a life for 15 years? As Memorial Day 2025 looms closer, every day feels like walking on a tightrope stretched across an abyss of uncertainty. My wife and I are no longer just fighting to save our relationship, we're grappling with the consequences of everything we've said and done, or failed to do, along this tumultuous journey. Every small victory in therapy, every tentative moment of intimacy, is shadowed by the fear that it might all unravel at any second. For her, the stakes are painfully clear. She must confront years of buried resentment, rediscover herself outside the confines of motherhood, and decide whether she can truly love me again, not as a roommate, but as a partner. For me, the burden is equally heavy. Can I forgive her emotional withdrawal? Can I trust that she won't retreat back into indifference if things don't go her way? And what happens if, despite all our efforts, we still can't bridge the chasm between us? The thought of losing her forever, a woman who has been my entire world, is paralyzing, yet the idea of staying in a loveless, sexless marriage feels like a betrayal of my own soul. No matter the outcome, one truth remains undeniable: neither of us will emerge from this unscathed. Whether together or apart, the scars of these battles, the sleepless nights, the tearful arguments, the sacrifices made and rejected will shape us for the rest of our lives.